What's up, my horror family? What would you do if the person trying to help you had a bag full of missing people's belongings in their truck? That's exactly what happened to Jason and Jamie. And it's just the beginning of tonight's nightmare. I've got 11 stories that will make you never want to drive alone again. Stories like Rains, trapped on a highway that doesn't exist, passing the same abandoned gas station every 30 minutes while their fuel tank mysteriously stays full. Or Holland, who kept waking up at truck stops with hours missing from their memory and disturbing photos on their phone they never took. Maurizio's family still can't explain the security footage showing them having full conversations with people who simply weren't there. Tonight, you're going to discover that the most dangerous predators don't lurk in dark alleys. They're waiting for you at rest stops, offering directions, and following your headlights for hundreds of miles. So kill those lights, lock your doors, and get ready for a road trip straight into hell. The most terrifying thing about accepting help from a stranger isn't what they might do to you. It's realizing you've been walking straight into their trap from the very beginning. I learned this lesson on a stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada, and I'll never forget the sound of duct tape being pulled from a roll in the darkness behind me. My name is Jason, and this happened 3 years ago when I was 24. I'd been dating Jamie for about 8 months, and we decided to take our first real road trip together. We were driving from Sacramento to Denver to visit her sister, taking the scenic route through Nevada because Jamie loved photographing desert landscapes. She had this old Canon camera that belonged to her grandfather, and she'd get so excited whenever we'd pass interesting rock formations or abandoned buildings. The trip started perfectly. We left early on a Friday morning, stopped for breakfast in Reno, and spent the afternoon driving through some of the most beautiful, desolate country I'd ever seen. Jamie must have taken 100 photos of the mountains and valleys, always asking me to pull over at scenic overlooks so she could get the perfect shot. We were laughing, singing along to her terrible road trip playlist, and talking about maybe doing more trips like this. Everything felt right. Like we were finally becoming a real couple instead of just two people who happened to be dating. The problem started around 4 in the afternoon, about 30 miles east of Fallon. Our 2019 Honda Civic started making this grinding noise that got worse with every mile. At first, I thought maybe we'd picked up some debris on the undercarriage, but the sound kept getting louder and more concerning. Jamie suggested we pull over and take a look, but I wanted to make it to the next town if possible. That turned out to be a mistake because 10 minutes later, the transmission started slipping badly, and I knew we weren't going anywhere. I pulled over at this desolate stretch where Highway 50 cut through nothing but sagebrush and rocky hills stretching to the horizon. No buildings, no other cars, no cell service, just endless desert in every direction. The silence was almost oppressive after hours of highway noise. Jamie tried calling Dora, but her phone showed no bars. Mine was the same. We popped the hood and stared at the engine like we had any idea what we were looking at, but honestly, neither of us knew the first thing about car repair. Jamie was getting anxious, checking her phone every few seconds and asking what we were going to do. The sun was starting to get lower, and I was beginning to worry about spending the night out there when headlights appeared in the distance. A pickup truck slowed down and pulled behind us. Hazard lights blinking, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. The man who got out looked like exactly the kind of helpful local you'd want to encounter in a situation like this. He was probably in his 50s, wearing work boots, a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap. He had this genuine smile and immediately asked if we needed help. He introduced himself as Dale and said he ran a garage back in Fallon. While he was talking, I noticed he had these calloused hands that looked like they'd done real mechanical work. and his truck had all the right tools and equipment scattered in the bed. Everything about him seemed legitimate. He looked under our hood for a few minutes, prodding at different components and making those knowing sounds that mechanics make. Finally, he straightened up and shook his head. "Your transmission's shot," he said. "This car isn't going anywhere without a tow truck and probably a week in the shop." Jamie's face fell, and I felt my stomach drop. Dale must have seen our expressions because he quickly added, "But don't worry. I can give you folks a ride back to town. You can call for a tow from there and figure out your next steps." I felt that relief again, and Jamie seemed to relax for the first time since we'd broken down. Dale seemed genuinely concerned about helping us, asking if we had somewhere to stay in town and whether we needed him to recommend a good hotel. We grabbed our overnight bags from the car, and I made sure to lock it, even though we were in the middle of nowhere. Dale's pickup truck was an older Ford, probably from the early 2000s, with a bench seat in front. Jamie sat between Dale and me, which felt safer somehow. Dale was incredibly friendly as we drove, asking about our trip and sharing stories about desert wildlife. He knew a lot about the area's history, pointing out old mining sites and explaining how the railroad used to run through certain valleys. He seemed like the kind of guy who'd lived in Nevada his whole life and genuinely enjoyed helping travelers who found themselves in trouble. But after about 15 minutes, I started to get confused about our direction. The sun was setting behind us, which meant we were driving east, deeper into the desert instead of back toward Fallon. When I mentioned this to Dale, he just smiled and said he knew a shortcut that would get us there faster. The road we were on was getting narrower and more isolated, winding between rocky outcroppings and through areas where the pavement was cracked and weathered. Jamie must have noticed too, because she grabbed my hand and squeezed it. I could feel her trembling slightly. "This doesn't look like the way to town," Jamie said quietly. Dale glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and something in his expression changed. The friendly, helpful demeanor just melted away, replaced by something cold and calculating. His voice dropped to this whisper as he told us to stay calm and that everything would be over soon. Those words sent ice through my veins because they sounded like something you'd say to someone you were about to hurt. Dale pulled off the main road onto this dirt track that led to what looked like an abandoned mining camp. There were a few dilapidated buildings scattered around, some rusted equipment, and piles of old lumber and debris. The place felt like it had been forgotten for decades. Dale parked near a metal shed and told us to get out slowly. That's when I heard it. The sound of duct tape being pulled from a roll somewhere in the darkness behind the truck. The sound was unmistakable and terrifying, like someone preparing to restrain people. Dale reached behind his seat and pulled out this duffel bag. When he unzipped it, I felt my world collapse. Inside were dozens of driver's licenses, cell phones, pieces of jewelry, wallets, and personal items that clearly belonged to different people. Some of the licenses looked new, others were faded and cracked like they'd been there for years. There was a woman's purse with the contents spilled out, a man's wedding ring, car keys from different manufacturers. Dale saw us staring and explained matter-of-factly that he'd been helping stranded travelers on Highway 50 for almost a decade, and that business was good. That's when I understood that our car breaking down wasn't some random mechanical failure. Dale had been following us, probably for miles, waiting for us to stop or for the perfect isolated location. Maybe he'd even done something to our car when we weren't looking, during one of our photo stops. The realization hit me that we weren't his first victims. We weren't even close. All those licenses and personal items represented real people who had trusted him just like we had. While Dale was distracted showing us his collection and explaining his operation, I grabbed a handful of sand from the ground and threw it directly in his face. He stumbled backward, cursing and clawing at his eyes. I shoved Jamie toward the truck and screamed at her to get inside. We managed to get both doors locked just as Dale recovered and started pounding on the windows, his face twisted with rage. The keys were still in the ignition. Either he was overconfident or he'd made his first mistake in years. I'd never driven a pickup truck before, especially not under these circumstances. But adrenaline took over completely. I started the engine and floored it back toward what I hoped was the main road. In the rearview mirror, I could see Dale running after us, screaming something we couldn't make out over the engine noise and our own panicked breathing. Jamie was crying and kept saying, "Oh my God," over and over again. I was shaking so badly I could barely steer straight. But somehow we made it back to Highway 50. We drove straight to the sheriff's office in Fallon, and I've never been so happy to see fluorescent lights and official buildings. The deputies took our statement and immediately sent units back to the mining camp. When they searched the area, they found evidence linking Dale to at least 15 different victims over the past 8 years. There were shallow graves, more personal belongings, and detailed records he'd kept of his activities. Dale was arrested 6 hours later, trying to cross into California, still covered in the sand I'd thrown at him. The prosecutor told us later that we were incredibly lucky. Most of Dale's victims had been solo travelers, people whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed for days or weeks. The fact that we were together and had fought back probably saved our lives. Jamie and I broke up about 2 months after this happened, not because of what Dale did to us, but because neither of us could stop thinking about that duffel bag and all those other people who hadn't been as fortunate as we were. Some roads in America don't follow the laws of physics. They follow something much darker and more ancient. I discovered this on a back highway in Montana, where time itself became my prison, and every mile I drove only took me further from escape. My name is Rain, and I'm a long-haul trucker who's been driving cross-country routes for 12 years. I thought I'd seen everything the American highway system could throw at me. Blizzards in Wyoming, dust storms in Arizona, fog so thick in Oregon that I couldn't see my own headlights. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Highway 2 in northern Montana 3 months ago. I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it, and I've seriously considered finding a different line of work. I was driving a load of electronics from Seattle to Minneapolis, taking my usual northern route through Glacier National Park. It was late October, and the weather had been perfect. Clear skies, good visibility, light traffic. I'd made this run probably 50 times over the years, and I knew every truck stop, every steep grade, every scenic overlook between the Pacific and the Great Lakes. Highway 2 through Montana is one of my favorite stretches because it's relatively straight, the scenery is incredible, and there are enough services to keep you comfortable without being overcrowded like the interstates. I'd stopped for dinner in Kalispell around 6 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and reach Minot, North Dakota by morning. The truck stop had good coffee, decent food, and I'd gotten some sleep the night before, so I felt ready for the long haul ahead. The sun was setting as I pulled back onto Highway 2, painting the mountains in these brilliant oranges and purples that made the whole landscape look like something out of a postcard. Traffic was light, just a few passenger cars and the occasional RV heading east toward the park entrances. Everything was completely normal until about an hour past Browning. I was maintaining a steady 70 miles per hour, listening to talk radio, when I noticed a gas station coming up on my right. It was one of those older independent stations with a vintage sign and 2 pumps, the kind you see in rural areas that somehow manage to stay in business despite being 50 miles from anywhere. The sign read, "Last Chance Gas," and advertised diesel fuel. I made a mental note of it because my fuel gauge was showing about 3/4 full, but it's always good to know where the next services are on these remote stretches. About 30 minutes later, I saw another gas station coming up on my right. At first, I thought it was just similar to the previous one. Rural areas sometimes have stations that look almost identical. But as I got closer, I realized it was exactly the same. Same vintage sign, same last chance gas lettering, same 2 pumps in the exact same configuration. Even the small building looked identical, down to the faded paint and the position of the windows. I slowed down to get a better look, and I noticed my fuel gauge was still showing 3/4 full, which didn't make sense after driving for 30 minutes. I checked my odometer and realized something was wrong. According to my trip meter, I'd only driven about 12 miles since leaving Kalispell. But I knew I'd been driving for over an hour at highway speeds. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd misread the odometer earlier, or maybe there was something wrong with my instruments. But my fuel gauge should have moved noticeably by now, and my engine hours meter should have advanced. Nothing was adding up. Another 30 minutes passed, and there it was again. The exact same gas station. Last chance gas with the same vintage sign. Same pumps, same building. This time I pulled over and got out to investigate. The station appeared to be abandoned, with dusty windows and no lights on inside. The fuel pumps were old mechanical models that probably hadn't worked in years. But what disturbed me most was that there were no tire marks in the dirt around the pumps. No evidence that anyone had been here recently. The place had that eerie stillness of somewhere that had been forgotten by time. I walked around the building and found a door that was slightly ajar. Inside was a small convenience store that looked like it had been abandoned in the 1980s. Shelves were still stocked with merchandise, but everything was covered in decades of dust. There were newspapers on the counter dated from 1987, and the cash register was an old mechanical model. Most unsettling was that the calendar on the wall was turned to October 1987, exactly 38 years ago to the day. I tried to take pictures with my phone, but the camera wouldn't work. The screen just showed static. Back at my truck, I noticed that my CB radio was picking up strange transmissions. Instead of the usual trucker chatter, I was hearing what sounded like radio shows from decades ago. Old music, vintage commercials, news broadcasts talking about events from the Reagan administration. I tried changing channels, but every frequency had the same type of programming. My GPS was showing my location as somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with no roads or landmarks marked. According to the satellite view, I was driving through empty wilderness. I decided to keep driving and see if I could break whatever pattern this was. But 30 minutes later, there was the gas station again. Same sign, same pumps, same building. My fuel gauge hadn't moved. My odometer showed I'd traveled exactly 12 miles from Kalispell, just like before. It was like I was trapped in some kind of temporal loop, reliving the same stretch of highway over and over again. The radio was still playing programming from 1987, and my phone had no signal at all. This continued for hours. Every 30 minutes, I'd pass the same gas station, and my instruments would reset to show the same readings. The landscape never changed. Same mountains, same trees, same road surface. I tried different approaches each time. Speeding up, slowing down, stopping at different points, even turning around and driving back toward Kalispell. But no matter what I did, I'd end up at that same gas station 30 minutes later. Around what should have been midnight, I encountered another vehicle for the first time since this started. It was an old pickup truck from the 1980s, driving in the opposite direction. I flashed my lights and tried to flag down the driver. but the truck just continued past me like I wasn't there. About 15 minutes later, I saw it again, driving the same direction I was going, and it passed me like it was in a hurry to get somewhere. The driver looked like he was wearing clothes from decades ago, and the truck had no modern safety equipment or emissions controls. That's when I realized I wasn't just trapped in a geographical loop. I was somehow caught in a temporal distortion that was cycling through the same time period over and over again. The gas station, the radio broadcasts, the other vehicles, even the quality of light all corresponded to 1987. Somehow, this stretch of Highway 2 was replaying the same October night from 38 years ago, and I'd gotten caught in it. I tried everything I could think of to break free. I drove off the road into the wilderness, but my truck would just stop running after a few hundred yards, and when I restarted it, I'd be back on the highway approaching the gas station. I tried destroying property at the station, breaking windows and overturning equipment, but everything would be back to normal on the next loop. I even tried staying at the station and not driving at all, but after exactly 30 minutes, I'd find myself back in my truck approaching the same location again. The worst part was the growing realization that I might not be the first person this had happened to. During one loop, I found initials carved into a wooden post behind the gas station. Dozens of them, with dates going back decades. Some were from the 1990s, others from the 2000s, and a few looked recent. There were messages too. Help me. Can't get out. Time is broken here. I added my own initials and the date, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. On what must have been my 20th or 30th loop, I noticed something different. The fuel gauge in my truck was showing empty instead of 3/4 full. I'd been so focused on the odometer and the time that I hadn't been paying attention to how much fuel I was actually consuming. If the gauge was accurate, I was almost out of diesel, which would leave me stranded at the gas station permanently. That thought terrified me more than anything else that had happened. Desperate, I tried something I hadn't considered before. Instead of driving through the loop, I parked my truck at the gas station and started walking east along the highway on foot. It was completely dark except for my flashlight, and the silence was oppressive. After about a mile, I found something that changed everything. A small historical marker that I'd never noticed while driving. It commemorated a tragic accident that had occurred on this exact stretch of road on October 15th, 1987, when a family of 4 had died in a collision during a sudden snowstorm. The marker explained that the accident had happened at exactly 11:30 p.m., which was the same time my loops had been resetting. According to the inscription, the family's car had skidded off the road and crashed into a tree during a freak weather event that had caught everyone by surprise. Emergency responders hadn't found them until the next morning. Reading this, I understood that I was somehow trapped in the final 30 minutes of these people's lives, experiencing their last journey over and over again. I don't know if it was reading about the accident or understanding the significance of what had happened, but something changed. When I walked back to my truck and started driving again, the landscape began to shift. The mountains looked different. The road's surface changed, and my instrument started working normally. After about 10 minutes, I passed a different gas station, a modern one with LED lighting and contemporary signage. My phone suddenly had signal again, and my GPS showed I was exactly where I should be on Highway 2, about 40 miles east of where I'd been trapped. I drove straight through to mine it without stopping, and when I checked my logbook, I discovered I'd lost almost 6 hours. According to my records and my delivery schedule, it was now early morning, but I had no memory of those missing hours beyond the repeating loops. I reported the incident to my dispatcher, but I couldn't explain what had happened in any way that made sense. Officially, I logged it as a navigation error and equipment malfunction. I've driven that same route twice since then, always during daylight hours, and I've never seen the Last Chance gas station again. But I've done some research, and I've found online forums where other drivers describe similar experiences on remote highways across the country. There are stories of temporal loops, missing time, and encounters with vehicles and people from different decades. Most people dismiss these as hallucinations or exhaustion. But I know what I experienced was real. The worst part is that I left my initials carved into that wooden post, along with all the others. Sometimes I wonder if those people ever escaped their loops, or if part of them is still there, trapped forever in those final 30 minutes, driving the same stretch of Montana highway through eternity. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through remote areas, I worry that I might find myself back there again, watching my fuel gauge drop toward empty with nowhere to go but around and around until time itself forgets I ever existed. The scariest part about having someone hide in your car isn't the moment you discover them. It's realizing they've been watching your family, learning your routines, and planning something for weeks without you knowing. I found this out during what was supposed to be a perfect family vacation, when we discovered that our SUV had been carrying an extra passenger for over 300 miles across Texas. My name is Trevor, and this happened 2 summers ago when I was taking my family on a cross-country road trip from Houston to the Grand Canyon. It was going to be our big summer adventure. Me, my wife Sarah, our 8-year-old son Philip, and our 10-year-old daughter Boston. We'd been planning this trip for months, mapping out all the scenic stops and tourist attractions along the way. Sarah had booked us into family-friendly hotels, and the kids were so excited they'd packed their bags a week early. I'd even taken 2 full weeks off work, which was something I rarely did, because I wanted this to be the kind of vacation our kids would remember forever. We left Houston early on a Saturday morning, driving my 2020 Chevy Tahoe that I'd just had serviced and detailed for the trip. The plan was to drive to Lubbock the first day, then continue northwest through New Mexico and Arizona over the next few days. Sarah had loaded the back cargo area with everything we could possibly need. Coolers full of snacks and drinks, games and books for the kids, camping chairs, emergency supplies, and enough luggage for all of us. The SUV was packed to capacity, but everything was organized and secure. The first few hours were perfect. The kids were entertained by their tablets and the scenery. Sarah was navigating and taking pictures, and I was enjoying the open road. We stopped in Huntsville for lunch and to stretch our legs, then continued northwest toward College Station. The weather was beautiful, traffic was light, and everyone was in great spirits. We played road trip games, sang along to music, and talked about all the things we wanted to see at the Grand Canyon. It felt like we were finally getting the family time we'd been too busy for during the regular school year. About 2 hours past College Station, somewhere between Madisonville and Crockett, Philip mentioned hearing weird noises coming from behind us. At first, we thought he was just being imaginative. 8-year-olds hear all kinds of things on long car rides. But when Sarah turned around to check on him, she heard it too. It sounded like something shifting or moving in the cargo area, but very quietly, like someone was trying not to be noticed. I suggested it might be something that had come loose when we went over a bump, but Sarah wanted me to pull over and check. I found a rest area near Crockett and parked in a spot away from other vehicles. When I opened the rear hatch, everything looked exactly the way we'd packed it. All our luggage was still secured, the coolers hadn't moved, and nothing appeared to be damaged or out of place. I rearranged a few items and made sure everything was tied down properly. but I couldn't find anything that might have been making noise. Sarah suggested that maybe one of the coolers had something loose inside, so we checked those too, but everything seemed fine. The kids were getting restless, so we got back on the road. About an hour later, Boston said she thought she saw something move in the rearview mirror, but when Sarah looked back, there was nothing unusual visible. Then Philip started complaining about a smell, something musty and unpleasant that seemed to be coming from the back of the SUV. Sarah and I couldn't smell anything from the front seats, and we figured it might be related to all the camping gear and outdoor equipment we'd packed. But the kids kept mentioning it, especially when the air conditioning was recirculating air from inside the vehicle, instead of bringing in fresh air from outside. We stopped for dinner in Lufkin, and while we were inside the restaurant, I decided to do a more thorough inspection of the cargo area. I moved everything around, checking behind and underneath all our packed items. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of food wrappers and an empty water bottle that definitely hadn't been there when we packed. They were wedged behind one of our larger suitcases, in a spot that would be hidden from casual observation but accessible to someone who knew exactly where to reach. I called Sarah outside without alerting the kids and showed her what I'd found. We both realized immediately that someone had been in our vehicle, but we couldn't figure out when or how. The SUV had been locked in our garage until we left that morning, and we'd been with it constantly during the trip, except for the few minutes we'd spent inside restaurants or rest stops. Sarah suggested that maybe the wrappers had been left there by the people who detailed the car. But I knew that wasn't right. The detailing had been done 3 days earlier, and these wrappers looked fresh. We decided to continue to our hotel in Lufkin rather than investigate further in a public parking lot. But both of us were on edge for the rest of the evening. After we checked in and got the kids settled in their room, I went back out to the parking lot with a flashlight to do a complete search of the vehicle. I pulled out every single item we'd packed, examining everything methodically. That's when I found evidence that someone had been living in our cargo area, not just hiding, but actually making themselves comfortable for an extended period. Behind a large duffel bag, I found a small nest-like area where someone had arranged some of our beach towels into a makeshift bed. There were more food wrappers, several empty water bottles, and most disturbing of all, a small notebook with handwritten entries. The writing was cramped and difficult to read, but I could make out enough to understand that someone had been documenting our family's activities, our travel schedule, and detailed observations about our daily routines. There were notes about what time we typically left the house, which routes we usually took to work and school, and even descriptions of our kids' personalities and habits. The notebook entries went back several weeks, which meant this person had been watching our family long before our vacation started. They knew our names, our address, our phone numbers, and intimate details about our lives that could only have come from extensive surveillance. There were sketches of our house, our cars, and even floor plans that showed they'd somehow been inside our home. Most terrifying was a section near the back of the notebook that outlined plans for what they intended to do with the information they'd gathered. I realized that this wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had specifically targeted our family and had been planning something for weeks or possibly months. They'd somehow gained access to our vehicle, probably while it was parked in our garage, and had been using it as a base of operations while they stalked us. The fact that they'd chosen to hide in our SUV during our vacation suggested they were escalating whatever plan they had in mind. I immediately called 911 and reported what I'd found. The local police arrived within 10 minutes and took the notebook and other evidence. They also found additional items that I'd missed. A small camera that had been positioned to record the interior of our vehicle, extra clothing, and a bag containing tools that could be used to disable car doors and windows from the inside. The officer explained that this was consistent with patterns they'd seen in cases involving stalkers who escalate to kidnapping or worse. While the police were processing the evidence, they discovered something even more disturbing. The person hiding in our SUV had apparently been taking photographs of our family during the trip. Pictures of us at rest stops, in restaurants, and even sleeping in our hotel room the previous night. The camera had a telephoto lens and sophisticated equipment for surveillance, suggesting this wasn't the work of an amateur. They'd been documenting our every move while remaining completely undetected. The investigation revealed that our stalker was a man named Richard Vance, who had been arrested several times in the Houston area for similar crimes. He'd been released from prison 6 months earlier after serving time for breaking into occupied homes and collecting personal information about families. According to the detective, Vance had a pattern of selecting families with young children and following them for weeks or months while planning abductions. Our family had apparently been his target because our routine was predictable, and our house was in a neighborhood where he could observe us without attracting attention. The most chilling discovery was that Vance had been inside our garage multiple times over the past month, not just to hide in our SUV, but to study our daily patterns and install surveillance equipment. He'd placed small cameras in our vehicles and even in parts of our house, giving him access to our private conversations and activities. The police found evidence that he'd been selling this type of information to other criminals, creating detailed profiles of families that could be used for identity theft, burglary, or worse crimes. Vance was arrested at a truck stop about 50 miles from where we'd discovered him, apparently planning to find another family to target. When police searched his motel room, they found similar notebooks documenting dozens of other families across Texas and Louisiana. He'd been operating this surveillance and stalking network for years, and our family had just been his most recent project. The prosecutor told us that if we hadn't discovered him when we did, he likely would have attempted to abduct one of our children during the remainder of our trip. We obviously canceled the rest of our vacation and drove straight home. But the experience changed our family forever. We had to move to a different house because we never felt safe, knowing that Vance had been inside our home so many times. The kids went through months of therapy to deal with the trauma of learning that a dangerous stranger had been watching them and planning to hurt them. Sarah still checks our vehicles obsessively before every trip. And I've installed security systems and cameras that would make it much harder for someone to surveil us again. The worst part is knowing how close we came to a tragedy that would have destroyed our family. If Philip hadn't mentioned hearing those noises, or if we dismissed the kids' concerns as typical road trip complaints, Vance would have continued implementing whatever plan he developed. The police believe he was waiting for us to reach a more remote location, possibly somewhere between Texas and Arizona, where he could act without witnesses or immediate police response. Our vacation was supposed to create happy memories for our children, but instead, it became a reminder of how vulnerable families can be to predators who are patient enough to study their victims and plan their crimes carefully. Richard Vance was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but knowing he's locked up doesn't completely eliminate the fear that someone else might be watching our family right now, learning our new routines and planning their own approach. We've learned that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who act impulsively. They're the ones who have the patience to study you until they know exactly how to destroy your life. The human mind isn't designed to process hearing your own voice screaming for help through a car radio before the accident that kills you actually happens. I learned this on the Pacific Coast Highway in California, where my best friend Crew and I discovered that some radio frequencies can tune into conversations with the dead. My name is Camden, and I'm 26 years old. This happened last spring when my best friend Crew and I decided to take a road trip up the California coast for his bachelor party. It was going to be just the two of us. a low-key celebration before his wedding in June. We'd been best friends since high school, and he wanted to do something meaningful instead of the typical Vegas bachelor party scene. The plan was to drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco over 4 days, staying at small coastal towns and taking our time to enjoy the scenery along Highway 1. We rented a 2022 Ford Mustang convertible because Crew had always dreamed of driving the PCH in a sports car. I thought it was a little impractical for a road trip, but it was his bachelor party, so I went along with it. We loaded up our luggage, picked up some snacks and drinks, and headed out of LA around noon on a Thursday in early April. The weather was perfect. Sunny, about 75 degrees, with just enough breeze to make driving with the top down comfortable. Crew was in an amazing mood, talking excitedly about the wedding and his future with his fiancée Emma. The first few hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. We drove through Malibu, stopped at a few beaches for photos, and made good time north toward Santa Barbara. The scenery was incredible. Dramatic cliffs, pristine beaches, and endless ocean views. We had the radio turned up, playing a mix of classic rock and songs from our high school years. Crew kept talking about how this was the perfect way to celebrate the end of his bachelor days. And I was happy to see him so relaxed and excited about his future. Around 5 in the afternoon, somewhere between Carpinteria and Santa Barbara, we hit an area where the highway winds through some particularly dramatic coastal terrain. The road curves back and forth between steep cliffs and the ocean, with very little shoulder and no guardrails in some sections. It's incredibly beautiful, but it demands your full attention when you're driving. Crew was behind the wheel, and he was being careful to maintain a safe speed despite the Mustang's capability to go much faster. That's when the radio started acting strange. We'd been listening to a classic rock station out of LA, but suddenly the signal became weak and staticky. Crew tried adjusting the tuning, but instead of finding a clearer station, we started picking up what sounded like emergency radio transmissions. Not the usual highway patrol or ambulance calls you sometimes hear, but civilian voices calling for help in what seemed like desperate situations. The first transmission we heard clearly was a man's voice saying, "Mayday, Mayday. This is the red Mustang convertible southbound on Highway 1 near Carpinteria. We've gone off the road and we're trapped in the vehicle. 2 occupants, both conscious but injured. Please send emergency assistance immediately." Crew and I looked at each other with confusion, because the voice had described our exact vehicle and location, but we were fine and driving normally on the highway. Crew tried changing the radio station, but every frequency seemed to be picking up similar distress calls. We heard a woman calling for help after her SUV had rolled over near Pismo Beach. A family describing their minivan sliding off the road during heavy fog near Big Sur. A motorcycle rider reporting that he'd crashed near Hearst Castle and needed medical attention. All of the calls were coming through clearly, as if they were happening in real time. But we weren't seeing any accidents or emergency vehicles in the areas they described. What made it even more disturbing was that many of the distress calls included extremely specific details about locations we were approaching. Someone would describe an accident at a particular curve or near a specific landmark. And then 20 or 30 minutes later, we'd drive through that exact location. The descriptions were so accurate that we started slowing down and being extra cautious at each spot. But we never saw any evidence of accidents or emergency activity. About an hour into this strange radio phenomenon, we heard something that made both of us go completely silent. It was Crew's voice, unmistakably, calling for emergency assistance. The transmission said, "This is Highway 1 northbound near Surf Beach. Red Mustang convertible has gone over the embankment. Driver is unconscious. Passenger appears to have serious head injuries. We need paramedics and rescue equipment immediately. The car is about 50 feet down the cliff face. Crew pulled over at the next safe spot, which happened to be a scenic overlook near Surf Beach. We sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just heard. It was definitely his voice. Not similar to his voice, but exactly his voice, with his speech patterns and even his way of pronouncing certain words. But he was sitting right next to me, completely unharmed, and our car was parked safely at a scenic overlook. The whole situation felt like some kind of elaborate prank or psychological experiment. But there was no logical explanation for how someone could have replicated his voice so perfectly. We tried rationalizing it in different ways. Maybe it was some kind of radio drama or emergency training exercise. Maybe there was atmospheric interference causing us to pick up old recorded transmissions from previous accidents. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate joke using advanced voice synthesis technology. But none of these explanations made sense given how specific and immediate the transmissions seemed to be. Against our better judgment, we decided to continue driving north. The radio kept broadcasting distress calls from different locations along our planned route. We heard about accidents near Pismo Beach, San Luis Obispo, and Morro Bay, all places we intended to drive through over the next few hours. Each transmission was detailed and urgent, describing specific types of vehicles and precise locations where accidents had supposedly occurred. Around sunset, somewhere between Morro Bay and Cambria, we heard another transmission in my voice. I was calling for help after our Mustang had apparently hit a deer and crashed into a tree near a place called Moonstone Beach. The voice was describing injuries that crew had sustained and asking for emergency medical response. Hearing my own voice describe a scenario where my best friend was seriously hurt was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. That's when we noticed something that changed everything. The radio wasn't just broadcasting random distress calls. It was predicting accidents that were about to happen at specific locations along our route. Every place described in the emergency transmissions corresponded to hazardous areas of Highway 1 where accidents frequently occur. Sharp curves, steep grades, areas with limited visibility, places where deer commonly cross the road. It was as if the radio was tuning into the final moments of people who had died in accidents at these locations, broadcasting their last desperate attempts to call for help. We started researching the locations on our phones when we stopped for dinner in Cambria. Using accident databases and news reports, we found that every spot mentioned in the radio transmissions had been the site of fatal accidents within the past few years. The red Mustang accident near Carpinteria had killed 2 college students in 2019. The SUV rollover near Pismo Beach had claimed a family of 4 in 2020. The motorcycle crash near Hearst Castle had killed a rider just 6 months earlier. The most disturbing discovery was that some of the accidents described in the radio transmissions hadn't happened yet, at least not according to any records we could find. The voice calls were describing future accidents, or potential accidents that could occur if we continued driving through those specific areas at night or in poor conditions. We decided to stay in Cambria for the night instead of continuing to drive in the dark. But even in our hotel room, we could hear the emergency transmissions coming through on any radio we turned on. The calls were becoming more frequent and more urgent, describing accidents that seemed to be happening in real time at locations just north of where we'd stopped. It was like listening to a continuous stream of people dying in car accidents along the exact route we were planning to take. The next morning, we checked local news and discovered that 3 separate fatal accidents had occurred on Highway 1 between Cambria and Big Sur during the night, all at locations and involving circumstances that matched the radio transmissions we'd heard. A sedan had gone off a cliff near San Simeon. A pickup truck had collided with a tree near Ragged Point. A family in an RV had crashed near Gorda. The details matched the distress calls we'd heard so precisely that we knew this wasn't coincidence. Crew wanted to turn around and drive back to LA. But I convinced him that we needed to continue north to understand what was happening. We left Cambria around noon, driving very slowly and being extremely cautious at every location that had been mentioned in the radio transmissions. The radio continued broadcasting emergency calls, but now they seemed to be describing accidents that were happening simultaneously with our journey. Near Big Sur, we encountered something that confirmed our worst fears. We came around a curve and found emergency vehicles responding to an accident that had just occurred. A red sports car that had gone off the road and down an embankment. As we drove slowly past the scene, we could hear the emergency responders on our radio calling for additional rescue equipment and describing the exact scenario we were witnessing. But we'd heard this same transmission an hour earlier, before the accident had actually happened. That's when we understood that the radio wasn't just picking up emergency calls from past accidents. It was somehow tuning into the moment of death itself, capturing the final desperate attempts of accident victims to call for help. And in some cases, it was broadcasting these calls before the accidents actually occurred, as if the voices of the dead were trying to warn other travelers about the dangers ahead. We made it to San Francisco, but both of us were profoundly changed by the experience. Crew postponed his wedding for several months because he was too traumatized to focus on celebration. I developed severe anxiety about driving on highways, especially in areas with poor cell service where emergency help might not be readily available. We've never talked publicly about what happened on that trip because we know how insane it sounds. But sometimes, late at night, I still tune through radio frequencies and listen for those distress calls. I've heard them on other highways in different states. Voices calling for help from accidents that happened years ago. Or in some cases, accidents that haven't happened yet. I've started keeping a log of these transmissions and cross-referencing them with accident reports, and the correlation is undeniable. The dead are trying to warn us about the dangers we can't see coming. The most haunting part is that I still sometimes hear my own voice, and Crew's voice calling for help from that Mustang near Surf Beach. According to the radio transmissions, we died in that accident. Our bodies were never found, and we're still calling for rescue from the bottom of a cliff where no one will ever hear us. Sometimes I wonder if we actually did die on that trip. And everything since then has been some kind of afterlife, where we're still trying to warn other travelers about the voices that call to them through their car radios. The most terrifying realization isn't that you're being followed. It's discovering that every rest stop across 3 states has the exact same people waiting for you, like they've been coordinating your route for weeks. I learned this during what should have been a simple cross-country move, when I realized that my travel plans had been leaked to a network of predators who were herding me towards something I was never supposed to survive. My name is Eliseo, and this happened 8 months ago when I was moving from Phoenix to Boston for a new job. I'm a software engineer, and I'd gotten an offer from a tech company that was too good to pass up. The plan was to drive cross-country over 5 days, taking my time to see parts of America I'd never experienced before. I'd sold most of my furniture and packed everything I cared about into my 2021 Honda Accord. It wasn't the most practical vehicle for a cross-country move, but I'm single with no kids, so I didn't need a lot of space. I'd spent weeks planning the route, using various travel apps and websites to identify interesting stops, good restaurants, and safe places to spend the night. My itinerary took me through New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky before reaching Massachusetts. I'd booked hotels in advance for each night and even made reservations at a few restaurants that had gotten great reviews online. Everything was organized and scheduled, which made me feel confident about traveling alone across unfamiliar territory. The first day went perfectly. I left Phoenix early Tuesday morning and drove to Albuquerque, stopping at several scenic overlooks and a Native American trading post near Flagstaff. The weather was beautiful, traffic was light, and I was enjoying the solitude and freedom of being on the open road. I checked into my hotel in Albuquerque around 6 in the evening, had dinner at a local restaurant, and felt like this was going to be exactly the kind of adventure I'd hoped for. The second day started normally too. I left Albuquerque around 8 in the morning, heading east toward Amarillo, Texas. I stopped for gas and coffee at a rest area near Santa Rosa, New Mexico, around 10:30. It was a typical highway rest stop. A few picnic tables, vending machines, restrooms, and a small building with tourist information. There were maybe a dozen other travelers there, mostly families and truck drivers taking breaks from the road. What I noticed, but didn't think much about at the time, was a group of 3 people who seemed to be paying attention to me. An older man in a cowboy hat, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair, and a younger guy with a baseball cap and sunglasses. They weren't obviously staring, but I caught them glancing in my direction several times while I was walking to and from my car. When I left the rest area, I saw them standing near a white pickup truck, watching me pull back onto the interstate. About 3 hours later, I stopped for lunch at a rest area near Tucumcari, New Mexico. It was a larger facility with a visitor center, gift shop, and several food vendors. I was standing in line to buy a sandwich when I noticed the same 3 people from the previous rest stop. The older man in the cowboy hat, the woman with gray hair, and the young guy with the baseball cap. They were sitting at a picnic table about 50 feet away, and when I made eye contact with the older man, he quickly looked away. This struck me as odd because Tucumcari was about 180 miles from where I'd seen them before. If they were traveling the same route I was, they would have had to drive significantly faster than the speed limit to arrive at the second rest stop before me. And if they were traveling in the opposite direction, it didn't make sense that I'd encounter them at 2 different locations along my planned route. I decided to test my suspicions by taking a different route than I'd originally planned. Instead of continuing straight east toward Amarillo, I took a detour south toward Lubbock, then east toward Oklahoma City. This added about an hour to my drive time, but it would take me through different rest stops and travel centers than my original itinerary. If these people were somehow following me, the detour would either lose them or confirm that something unusual was happening. I stopped for gas at a truck stop near Levelland, Texas, around 4 in the afternoon. While I was filling my tank, I saw a white pickup truck pull into the parking area, and sure enough, the same 3 people got out. The older man, the woman, and the young guy with a baseball cap. This time there was no question they were focused on me. The woman pointed in my direction and said something to her companions that made them all look directly at me. I finished filling my tank quickly and went inside to pay, hoping to get a better look at these people and maybe figure out what they wanted. Inside the truck stop, I pretended to browse the merchandise while keeping an eye on them. They seemed to be communicating with someone on their phones, and I could hear fragments of their conversation that included references to my car's license plate number and my approximate location. That's when I realized this wasn't a coincidence or a case of travelers happening to take the same route. These people were actively tracking my movements and coordinating with others to monitor my progress across the country. The fact that they knew my license plate number suggested they had access to information about my travel plans that should have been private. I decided to drive to Oklahoma City without stopping again. hoping to lose them or reach a location where I could contact law enforcement. But when I stopped for the night at a hotel near the airport, I saw the same white pickup truck in the parking lot. The three people were nowhere to be seen, but their vehicle was definitely there, parked in a spot where they could observe the hotel entrance. I didn't sleep well that night, and I left the hotel early the next morning without checking out properly. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever was following me. I drove straight through Oklahoma and into Arkansas, stopping only for gas and using restrooms at the most crowded, well-lit facilities I could find. But at every stop, I encountered the same pattern. Different people, but clearly part of the same network. At a rest area near Fort Smith, Arkansas, there was a family with 2 young children who kept watching me and taking pictures with their phones. At a truck stop near Little Rock, an elderly couple approached me and tried to start a conversation about my travel plans, asking detailed questions about where I was going and how long I planned to stay in each city. Most disturbing was a stop I made near Memphis, Tennessee. I was getting gas at a station near the interstate when a man in his 30s approached me and said he'd been asked to give me a message. He claimed that people I'd never met were concerned about my safety and wanted me to change my route to avoid dangerous areas ahead. When I asked who had sent him, he became evasive and walked away quickly. That's when I understood that this wasn't just surveillance. Someone was trying to manipulate my travel route for reasons I couldn't understand. The people following me weren't just observing my movements. They were trying to influence my decisions and guide me toward specific locations or away from others. I decided to completely abandon my planned route and drive straight to Boston using only major interstates, avoiding all rest stops except for emergency fuel. But even this strategy didn't work. At a truck stop near Nashville, I encountered a group of people who seemed to know exactly where I was going and when I planned to arrive. They had detailed information about my new job, my apartment lease, and even my schedule for my first week in Boston. The most frightening encounter happened at a rest area near Lexington, Kentucky. I'd stopped to use the restroom and grab a coffee, planning to drive straight through to Boston without sleeping. As I was walking back to my car, a woman approached me and handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a detailed dossier about my life. Photos of my apartment in Phoenix, copies of my employment records, my credit report, and even surveillance photos of me at various locations during my trip. There was also a note explaining that I had been selected for something called a relocation assessment, and that my cooperation was required for the process to continue smoothly. The note included instructions to proceed to a specific address in rural Kentucky instead of continuing to Boston. It claimed that representatives would meet me there to discuss opportunities that would be more beneficial than my planned employment in Massachusetts. I threw the envelope in a trash can and got in my car immediately. But as I was leaving the rest area, I noticed several vehicles following me back onto the interstate. They maintained a loose formation around my car, never getting too close, but clearly coordinating their movements to keep me under surveillance. When I tried to exit at different ramps to lose them, they would anticipate my moves and position themselves to block my escape routes. For the next 6 hours, I was essentially being herded north and east by a convoy of vehicles that seemed to be in constant communication with each other. Every time I tried to deviate from the route they wanted me to take, they would close in and force me back onto their preferred path. It was like being a sheep guided by border collies, except the stakes were obviously much higher than livestock management. I finally managed to escape this convoy by driving into downtown Louisville during rush hour traffic and abandoning my car in a crowded parking garage. I took a taxi to the airport and bought a last-minute flight to Boston, leaving all my belongings behind. Within 24 hours, I was in my new apartment, but I was too terrified to retrieve my car or most of my possessions. The investigation that followed revealed that I had been targeted by a sophisticated human trafficking network that specialized in intercepting people during major life transitions, like cross-country moves. They would identify targets through job placement websites, apartment rental applications, and other online sources that revealed when someone would be traveling alone with limited social connections at their destination. The network included dozens of people stationed at rest stops, truck stops, and hotels along major interstate corridors. They would track targeted individuals across multiple states, gathering intelligence and looking for opportunities to isolate them in remote locations. The ultimate goal was usually to kidnap people who wouldn't be missed immediately and force them into various forms of labor or exploitation. Law enforcement officials told me that my case was unusual because I had managed to recognize the pattern and escape before reaching the final phase of their operation. Most victims never realize they're being tracked until it's too late to avoid the trap. The address in Kentucky where they wanted me to go was an abandoned warehouse, where several other missing persons cases had eventually led. The people involved in tracking me were arrested over the following months, but the investigation revealed that the network was much larger than initially suspected. They had been operating for years across multiple states, targeting hundreds of people who were traveling alone during major life changes. Many of the missing persons cases that law enforcement had attributed to random highway crimes were actually the result of this organized trafficking operation. I never retrieved my car or the belongings I'd left in it. The vehicle was eventually found stripped and abandoned in a rural area of Kentucky, and most of my possessions had been destroyed or sold. But I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have escaped with my life. The FBI agent handling my case said that based on the evidence they recovered, very few people who reached that final address in Kentucky were ever seen again. I still can't travel on highways without feeling paranoid about being followed. Every rest stop feels like a potential trap, and every friendly stranger seems like they might be part of another network. The most disturbing realization is how vulnerable we all are during those transition periods in our lives when we're traveling alone through unfamiliar territory with no one expecting to hear from us for days at a time. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who've been dead for decades, still trying to find their way home from accidents that claimed their lives before you were even born. I discovered this truth on a stormy night in the Appalachian Mountains, when I picked up a hitchhiker who knew things about my childhood that I'd never told another living soul. My name is Colson, and I'm a traveling sales representative for a medical equipment company based in Atlanta. This happened last October when I was driving from a conference in Asheville, North Carolina, back to my home in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'd been making this drive for about 3 years, usually taking Interstate 40 through the mountains. But that particular night, there was a major accident that had closed the highway for several hours. The detour signs directed traffic onto Highway 25, which winds through some of the most remote and mountainous terrain in the region. I'd left Asheville around 7 in the evening, planning to be home by 10:30 at the latest. My wife Sarah was expecting me, and we had plans to take our kids hiking the next morning at Cove Lake State Park. The weather had been threatening rain all day, and by the time I got onto Highway 25, it was coming down steadily. Not heavy enough to be dangerous, but enough to make driving more challenging on the winding mountain roads. Highway 25 through that part of North Carolina and Tennessee is beautiful during the day, but at night it can be intimidating. The road curves back and forth through dense forest, with steep drop-offs on one side and rock walls on the other. There are very few lights, no cell phone service in many areas, and sometimes you can drive for 20 or 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle. It's the kind of road where a breakdown or accident could leave you stranded for hours before anyone found you. About 45 minutes into the detour, somewhere near Hot Springs, North Carolina, I came around a curve and saw someone standing on the side of the road with their thumb out. It was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing what looked like a heavy winter coat, despite the relatively mild October weather. He was standing under a tree, trying to stay out of the rain, and he looked genuinely distressed. My first instinct was to keep driving. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, especially at night in remote areas. But something about his situation made me feel sorry for him. I pulled over about 50 yards past where he was standing and waited for him to catch up to my car. When he got closer, I could see that he was soaked through and shivering. He looked like he'd been walking for a long time, and his clothes were old-fashioned in a way that seemed unusual. Not vintage or retro, but genuinely outdated, like they were from a different era entirely. His hair was slicked back with rain, and he had this desperate look in his eyes that made me think he was in real trouble. When I rolled down the passenger window, he immediately started thanking me profusely for stopping. His voice had a distinctive Appalachian accent, and he spoke in a formal, polite way that reminded me of my grandfather's generation. He said his name was Harold Brewster, and that his car had broken down several miles back. He needed to get to Knoxville to see his daughter, who was in the hospital after a serious accident. The way he described the situation made it clear that this was a family emergency, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him stranded on the highway. Harold got into my car gratefully, settling into the passenger seat with a sigh of relief. He was still shivering, so I turned up the heat and offered him a towel from my gym bag. While he was drying off, he started talking about his daughter and how worried he was about her condition. He described the hospital where she was being treated, the doctors who were caring for her, and the specific injuries she'd sustained in what he said was a car accident on this same highway. As we continued driving north toward Tennessee, Harold's conversation became increasingly personal. He started asking about my family, my job, and my life in Knoxville. But his questions weren't the kind of polite small talk you'd expect from a stranger. They were specific and detailed, as if he already knew the answers and was just confirming information. He asked about my wife Sarah by name, mentioned that we had 2 children, and even knew details about the house we'd bought 2 years earlier. When I asked how he could possibly know these things, Harold said he'd lived in Knoxville most of his life and knew a lot of people in the area. He claimed he'd heard about my family through mutual acquaintances, though he couldn't provide specific names when I pressed him for details. His explanations were plausible but vague, and I started feeling uncomfortable about how much personal information this stranger seemed to have about my life. About 20 minutes after picking him up, Harold started sharing memories that made no sense given our supposed first meeting. He talked about watching me play Little League baseball when I was 8 years old, describing specific games and even remembering the position I played. He mentioned a fishing trip my father had taken me on when I was 12, recalling details about the lake we'd visited and the fish we'd caught that I'd never shared with anyone outside my immediate family. Most disturbing was when Harold started talking about my grandmother, who had passed away when I was 15. He described conversations he'd supposedly had with her, recalled stories she used to tell about our family history, and even mentioned a secret hiding place in her house where she'd kept old photographs and letters. These were things that only my grandmother and I had known about, private moments and memories that I'd never discussed with anyone else. I started to panic, thinking that Harold might be some kind of stalker who had been researching my background for unknown reasons. But his knowledge went beyond what someone could learn through normal surveillance or investigation. He knew about conversations I'd had with my grandmother when I was alone in her house. Details about my thoughts and feelings during private moments that no outsider could have observed or recorded. When I confronted Harold about how he could know such personal information, his demeanor changed completely. The desperate, grateful hitchhiker disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed sad and resigned. He looked at me with these tired, ancient eyes and said he'd been trying to get home to Knoxville for 43 years. Ever since the night he'd died in a car accident on this same stretch of highway. Harold explained that he'd been driving to see his daughter in the hospital, the same emergency he described to me when he'd lost control of his car during a winter storm in 1980. His vehicle had gone off the road near Hot Springs and crashed into a ravine where it wasn't found for several weeks. By the time rescue workers located the wreckage, Harold had been dead for over a month. And his daughter had died in the hospital while he was lying undiscovered at the bottom of the mountain. He said he'd been walking this highway ever since, trying to complete the journey he'd never finished. Every few months or years, someone would pick him up, and he'd ride with them as far as they were willing to take him toward Knoxville. But he could never quite make it home, and he always ended up back at the same spot near Hot Springs, walking through the rain and trying to flag down another ride. Harold's knowledge of my personal life, he explained, came from the fact that he'd been watching over families in the Knoxville area for decades, particularly those with children who reminded him of the daughter he'd never been able to save. He'd been present during important moments in my childhood and adolescence, invisible but caring, trying to provide the kind of protection and guidance he'd never been able to give his own child. As he told me this story, I noticed that the temperature in my car was dropping despite the heater running at full blast. Harold's clothes were no longer dripping wet, but they weren't drying either. They seemed to exist in a state of permanent dampness, like they were frozen in the moment of that long-ago rainstorm. When I looked directly at him, his features were clear and solid. But when I glanced at him peripherally, he seemed translucent and unstable. I realized that I was either experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, or I was actually giving a ride to someone who had died before I was born. Neither possibility was comforting, but Harold's presence felt genuinely benevolent rather than threatening. He wasn't trying to harm me or manipulate me. He just wanted to complete a journey that death had interrupted 4 decades earlier. When we reached the Tennessee border, Harold asked me to pull over at a scenic overlook that provided a view of the lights of Knoxville in the distance. He said he could see his destination from there, and that was enough to satisfy the compulsion that had been driving him for so many years. He thanked me for the ride and got out of the car, but when I turned around to watch him walk away, there was no one there. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, trying to process what had happened. When I got to my house, I immediately went to my computer and started researching Harold Brewster. It didn't take long to find newspaper articles from December 1980 describing the disappearance and eventual discovery of a man matching his description. The articles confirmed every detail he'd told me about his accident, his daughter's hospitalization, and the circumstances of his death. The most unsettling discovery was a photograph accompanying one of the newspaper articles. It showed Harold Brewster at his funeral, and he looked exactly the same as the man who had ridden in my car that night. Same face, same hair, even the same clothes he'd been wearing when his body was found. The only difference was that in the newspaper photo, he looked peaceful and at rest, while the Harold I'd met had seemed driven by an urgency that death hadn't been able to resolve. I've driven Highway 25 several times since that night, but I've never seen Harold again. I like to think that our conversation and that view of Knoxville from the scenic overlook gave him whatever closure he needed to finally move on to whatever comes after this life. But sometimes, during storms, or on particularly dark nights, I still look for hitchhikers on that stretch of road, wondering if there are other spirits like Harold still trying to complete journeys that were interrupted by tragedy. The experience changed my perspective on death and the connections between people in ways I'm still trying to understand. I've become more aware of the presence of others around me, both living and dead, and more conscious of the unfinished business that might keep someone tied to this world long after their physical life has ended. Harold taught me that love and responsibility don't necessarily end with death, and that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we take to help others find their way home. The worst feeling in the world isn't being followed by someone who wants to hurt you. It's realizing they've been herding you like cattle for hundreds of miles, coordinating every move to guide you exactly where they want you to go. I learned this during what started as a routine night drive through the Midwest, when I discovered that multiple vehicles were working together to trap me on a highway that led to something I was never meant to survive. My name is Keanu, and I work as a freelance photographer specializing in automotive events across the country. This happened 6 months ago when I was driving from a car show in Chicago back to my home in Denver. I'd been at the show for 3 days, photographing custom builds and racing events, and I was exhausted but eager to get home. My plan was to drive straight through the night, covering the 920 miles in about 14 hours with minimal stops. I left Chicago around 9 p.m. on a Sunday, figuring I'd hit lighter traffic by traveling at night and avoiding the Monday morning rush hour in the cities I'd pass through. My equipment was secured in the back of my 2020 Toyota 4Runner, and I had enough coffee and energy drinks to keep me alert for the long drive ahead. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, no wind, and temperatures in the mid-60s. Everything seemed set up for an easy, uneventful trip home. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I made good time through Illinois and into Iowa, stopping only once for gas and a bathroom break near the Quad Cities. Traffic was light, mostly long-haul truckers and other night drivers heading west on Interstate 80. I was listening to podcasts and enjoying the solitude of night driving, feeling relaxed and confident about reaching Denver by late morning. Around midnight, somewhere between Iowa City and Des Moines, I noticed a dark SUV in my rearview mirror that seemed to be maintaining the same speed and following distance, regardless of my driving patterns. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I changed lanes, it would change lanes a few seconds later. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Plenty of drivers on long trips use cruise control and maintain consistent speeds. But after about 45 minutes of this pattern, I decided to test whether the SUV was actually following me. I took an exit near Grinnell, Iowa, circled through a gas station parking lot, and got back on the interstate, heading in the same direction. The SUV followed me through the entire detour, maintaining its position about a quarter-mile behind my vehicle. There was no legitimate reason for another driver to make the same unnecessary exit and return to the highway unless they were specifically tracking my movements. I started paying closer attention to the traffic around me and realized that the dark SUV wasn't the only vehicle exhibiting unusual behavior. There was a pickup truck about half a mile ahead of me that seemed to be maintaining a specific speed designed to keep me from passing. Every time I tried to overtake it, the truck would accelerate just enough to stay ahead, then slow back down when I fell behind. Behind the SUV following me, there was a sedan that appeared to be maintaining a consistent position as well. Over the next hour, as I continued west toward Des Moines, I became increasingly convinced that I was being followed by a coordinated group of vehicles. They weren't being obvious about it. They maintained reasonable distances and avoided drawing attention to themselves. But their movements were too synchronized to be random. When I changed lanes, they would adjust their positions accordingly. When I varied my speed, they would compensate to maintain the same relative spacing. Around 2 a.m. near Newton, Iowa, I decided to take a more dramatic evasive action to confirm my suspicions. I suddenly took an exit and drove into a 24-hour truck stop, parking in a well-lit area near the main building. Within 2 minutes, all three vehicles, the SUV, the pickup truck, and the sedan, had taken the same exit and were parked in different areas of the truck stop parking lot, positioned so they could observe my vehicle from multiple angles. I went inside the truck stop and bought coffee, using the opportunity to get a better look at the people in these vehicles. The SUV contained 2 men in their 30s, both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps. The pickup truck had an older man driving alone, and the sedan had a woman and a younger man. None of them got out of their vehicles while I was inside, but I could see them watching the building entrance and clearly communicating with each other via cell phones. When I returned to my 4Runner and left the truck stop, all three vehicles followed me back onto Interstate 80, resuming their previous positions around me. At this point, I was certain I was being pursued by people with malicious intent, but I couldn't understand their strategy. They weren't trying to force me off the road or box me in. They seemed content to follow me and keep me moving west at a steady pace. About an hour later, near Colfax, Iowa, I noticed something that made the situation much more frightening. The pickup truck that had been ahead of me moved into the right lane and slowed down, apparently encouraging me to pass. But when I tried to take the left lane and overtake it, a semi-truck suddenly appeared and blocked my path, forcing me to stay behind the pickup. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The truck driver was clearly part of whatever operation was being conducted around me. Over the next several hours, as I continued across Iowa and into Nebraska, I encountered more vehicles that appeared to be part of this coordinated effort. Cars would appear from on-ramps at precisely the right moments to limit my options for changing lanes or altering my route. Trucks would position themselves to prevent me from passing or slowing down beyond certain parameters. It was like being guided through an invisible maze where my choices were being controlled by people I couldn't see. Around 5 a.m., somewhere near Grand Island, Nebraska, I realized that these vehicles weren't just following me randomly. They were herding me toward a specific destination. Every time I tried to take an exit or change my route, they would position themselves to make those options difficult or impossible. When I tried to pull over at rest areas or gas stations, they would create traffic situations that discouraged stopping. I was being guided west on Interstate 80 at a pace and along a route that someone else had predetermined. The most frightening aspect was that this operation involved far more people than I'd initially realized. As different vehicles peeled off at various exits, new ones would appear to take their places. It was like a relay race where the baton was me, being passed from one team of pursuers to the next across multiple states. The coordination required for this kind of operation suggested a large, well-funded organization with extensive resources and planning capabilities. Near North Platte, Nebraska, I tried to break free from this convoy by taking an unexpected exit and driving south on Highway 83. But within 10 minutes, I encountered a roadblock that appeared to be a routine police checkpoint. When I stopped, the officer who approached my car asked for my license and registration, then spent an unusually long time examining my documents while speaking quietly into his radio. After about 15 minutes, he returned my paperwork and told me the road ahead was closed for construction, directing me back to Interstate 80. Later investigation revealed that there was no legitimate police checkpoint at that location that night, and no construction work that would have required road closures. The entire encounter had been fabricated to prevent me from deviating from Interstate 80 and to waste time that allowed the pursuing vehicles to reposition themselves around me. When I got back on the interstate, the same pattern resumed. Vehicles ahead, behind, and alongside me, maintaining positions that limited my options and guided my movement. But now I understood that this wasn't just surveillance or harassment. These people were directing me toward a specific location for a specific purpose, and given the resources they were investing in this operation, their intentions were almost certainly lethal. Around sunrise, near Big Springs, Nebraska, close to the Colorado border, I noticed that the vehicles around me were tightening their formation. Instead of maintaining loose positions that allowed me some freedom of movement, they were boxing me in more aggressively. The pickup truck ahead reduced its following distance. The SUV behind moved closer, and cars in adjacent lanes positioned themselves to prevent lane changes. That's when I realized we were approaching whatever destination they'd been guiding me toward for the past 8 hours. The terrain in that area is relatively isolated, with long stretches between towns and limited options for getting help or witnesses. If these people intended to force me off the road or stage an accident, this would be an ideal location to do it without interference from law enforcement or bystanders. Instead of allowing them to complete whatever plan they'd developed, I made a desperate decision to create my own accident. I suddenly swerved toward the median, crossed into oncoming traffic, and drove the wrong way on the eastbound lanes for about half a mile before taking an exit that led to a small farming community. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous, but it scattered the vehicles that had been surrounding me and gave me an opportunity to escape their control. I drove to the local sheriff's office in Big Springs and reported what had happened. The deputy who took my statement was initially skeptical, but when we reviewed traffic camera footage from various locations along Interstate 80, the coordinated movement of vehicles around my 4Runner was clearly visible. The footage showed the same vehicles following me across multiple counties, maintaining consistent formations and working together to control my route and speed. The investigation that followed revealed that I had been targeted by a criminal organization that specialized in highway robberies and kidnappings. They would identify high-value targets, people traveling alone with expensive equipment or vehicles, and use coordinated pursuit tactics to guide them to remote locations where they could be robbed or worse without witnesses. My photography equipment, vehicle, and the fact that I was traveling alone had made me an attractive target for this group. Law enforcement officials explained that this type of coordinated highway crime was becoming more common, particularly in remote areas of the Midwest, where cell phone coverage was spotty and police response times were slow. The criminals would use multiple vehicles and sophisticated communication systems to track targets across several states, waiting for optimal conditions to complete their crimes. Several arrests were made in connection with my case, but many of the people involved were never identified. The organization was much larger than initially suspected, with participants spread across multiple states and sophisticated methods for recruiting drivers and coordinating operations. My escape disrupted one specific crime, but the network continued operating in other areas. I never completed that drive to Denver. After giving my statement to law enforcement, I flew home and had my 4Runner shipped by a transport company. I still do automotive photography, but I no longer drive long distances alone, especially at night through remote areas. The experience taught me that our highways are hunting grounds for predators who are much more organized and sophisticated than most people realize. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how vulnerable we all are during those long, solitary drives across America. We assume that other drivers are just random people going about their own business. But some of them are actively looking for victims and using our highways like trap lines to catch prey. The coordination and resources required for the operation I encountered suggests that highway crime has evolved far beyond random carjackings or robberies. It's become a systematic form of predation that most travelers never see coming until it's too late to escape. The most unsettling thing about finding an entire town abandoned isn't the empty streets or silent buildings. It's discovering fresh coffee still warm in cups and meals half-eaten on tables, as if hundreds of people simply vanished mid-conversation. I experienced this nightmare with my family in what appeared to be a thriving Kansas farming community, where we stopped for gas and returned 20 minutes later to find ourselves the only living souls in a place that shouldn't exist. My name is Mauricio, and this happened 14 months ago when I was driving cross-country with my wife and 2 children, Salem and Dario. We were moving from Portland, Oregon to my new job in Atlanta, Georgia, taking the scenic route through the heartland so the kids could see parts of America they'd never experienced. It was supposed to be an educational family adventure, giving us quality time together while transitioning to our new life on the East Coast. We'd been driving for 3 days, taking our time and stopping at interesting historical sites and small towns along the way. The kids were actually enjoying the trip more than I'd expected. 12-year-old Salem was keeping a travel journal and taking photos of everything, while 10-year-old Dario was collecting postcards and souvenirs from each state we passed through. My wife Maria was handling the navigation and had researched family-friendly attractions and restaurants at each overnight stop. On our 4th day, we were driving east on Highway 36 through north-central Kansas, planning to reach Kansas City by evening. It was a beautiful September afternoon, with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. The landscape was classic Great Plains, rolling hills covered with wheat fields and corn, small farmhouses scattered across the countryside, and those endless blue skies that make you understand why people love the Midwest. Around 3 in the afternoon, we needed to stop for gas and let the kids stretch their legs. We'd been driving for about 2 hours since our last break, and Dario was getting restless in the back seat. I saw a sign advertising services at the next exit, and when we crested a hill, we could see a small town spread out in the valley below. It looked like a typical Kansas farming community. A few dozen houses, some commercial buildings along what appeared to be a main street, and a grain elevator rising above the surrounding structures. The town was called Millbrook, according to the welcome sign, with a population of 847. As we drove down the main street looking for a gas station, I was impressed by how well-maintained and prosperous everything looked. The houses were freshly painted, the lawns were neatly trimmed, and there were flowers blooming in gardens throughout the residential area. The commercial district had several thriving businesses: a hardware store, a cafe, a small grocery market, and an old-fashioned 5 and dime shop that looked like it had been operating since the 1950s. We found a gas station at the far end of town, and I pulled up to one of the pumps while Maria and the kids went inside to use the restrooms and buy snacks. The station was busy. There were several other cars getting gas, people coming and going from the convenience store, and a steady stream of local residents stopping by for fuel and supplies. Everyone seemed friendly and relaxed, nodding hello and making small talk about the weather and local events. While I was filling the tank, an older man at the next pump struck up a conversation about our Oregon license plates and our cross-country journey. He was a retired farmer who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life, and he was genuinely interested in hearing about our move and our impressions of Kansas. He recommended a restaurant in town if we wanted to get lunch, and he gave me directions to a historical marker a few miles east that commemorated a stop on the old Santa Fe Trail. Maria and the kids came back with arms full of snacks and drinks, along with postcards and a small Kansas flag for Dario's collection. Salem had struck up a conversation with some local teenagers who were hanging out at the store, and she was excited to tell me about a county fair that was happening the following weekend. The kids were asking if we could stay in Millbrook overnight instead of continuing to Kansas City, but I explained that we had hotel reservations and needed to stick to our schedule. After paying for the gas, We decided to drive through the residential part of town so the kids could see more of small-town America. The neighborhoods were charming. Tree-lined streets with sidewalks, children playing in front yards, elderly people sitting on porches, and the kind of peaceful, safe atmosphere that you associate with classic American communities. We passed a small park where a Little League game was in progress, complete with parents cheering from the bleachers and kids selling concessions from a folding table. We also drove past what appeared to be the town's main gathering place, a community center where some kind of social event was taking place. There were cars parked around the building, people walking in and out carrying covered dishes, and decorations hanging from the windows. It looked like a church social or community dinner, the kind of event that brings entire small towns together on weekend afternoons. Before leaving Millbrook, we stopped at the cafe the farmer had recommended, planning to get coffee and pie for the adults and ice cream for the kids. The place was busy with what appeared to be the usual afternoon crowd, farmers taking a break from field work, elderly residents socializing over coffee, and families treating their children to after-school snacks. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and the waitress who served us was friendly and talkative, asking about our trip and recommending other attractions we might enjoy along our route. We spent about 20 minutes in the cafe, long enough for the kids to finish their ice cream, and for Maria and me to drink our coffee and share a piece of apple pie that the waitress insisted we try. The other customers were friendly without being intrusive, and several people wished us well on our journey and said they hoped we'd have a chance to visit Kansas again in the future. When we left the cafe and walked back to our car, something felt different about the town. But I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The streets looked the same, the buildings were unchanged, and our car was exactly where we'd parked it. But there was a quality to the silence that hadn't been there before. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town in the late afternoon, but an absolute absence of sound that seemed unnatural. As we drove back through the residential area toward the highway, I realized what was bothering me. There were no people visible anywhere. No children playing in the yards, no elderly residents on their porches, no teenagers hanging out on street corners. The cars were still parked in driveways and along the streets, but it was as if every human being had simply disappeared while we were inside the cafe. When we reached the community center where the social event had been taking place, the parking lot was still full of cars, but there was no activity around the building. The decorations were still hanging in the windows, and the front doors were standing open, but no one was going in or out. It looked like everyone had abandoned the event in the middle of whatever celebration had been taking place. The gas station where we'd stopped earlier was completely deserted. The pumps were still operational, the convenience store lights were on, and there were cars parked at the pumps, but no customers or employees were visible anywhere. It was as if everyone had simply vanished between the time we'd left to explore the town and our return 20 minutes later. Maria suggested that maybe there was some kind of emergency that had required everyone to evacuate quickly. But we weren't seeing any emergency vehicles or signs of crisis. The cars were parked normally, not abandoned hastily. The buildings showed no signs of damage or distress. Everything looked exactly the way it had when we'd first arrived, except for the complete absence of people. We decided to investigate the cafe where we'd just been served, thinking that surely the waitress and other customers would still be there. But when we looked through the windows, the restaurant was empty. Our coffee cups and pie plate were still sitting on the table where we'd left them, along with the check and the money I'd left for a tip. The other tables still had partially consumed meals and drinks, as if the customers had been interrupted mid-bite and simply walked away. Salem wanted to go inside and look around, but something about the situation felt wrong enough that I didn't want my family separated or exposed to whatever might be causing this apparent mass disappearance. We got back in our car and drove quickly through the rest of the town, looking for any signs of human activity or explanations for what we were witnessing. Every business we passed showed the same pattern. Lights on, doors open in some cases, cars parked outside, but no people anywhere. The hardware store had a customer's truck parked outside with the driver's door standing open and shopping bags sitting on the seat. But no sign of the driver. The grocery store had shopping carts abandoned in the aisles and a cash register drawer standing open as if a transaction had been interrupted. Most disturbing was the park where the Little League game had been in progress when we'd driven through earlier. The baseball equipment was still scattered on the field, the scoreboard was still displaying the inning and score, and there were drinks and snacks abandoned in the bleachers. But the players, coaches, parents, and spectators had all disappeared, leaving behind only the evidence of activities that had been interrupted without warning. We drove to the edge of town and pulled over to discuss what we should do. None of us could explain what we'd witnessed, and we were all feeling increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. Maria suggested calling 911 to report what appeared to be some kind of mass emergency. But when I tried to use my cell phone, there was no signal. Even our GPS had stopped working, showing our location as an empty area with no towns or roads marked. That's when I realized we might be dealing with something beyond a normal emergency situation. I drove back into Millbrook to the town's main intersection, where there should have been street signs identifying the roads and confirming the town's name. But the signs we'd seen earlier were no longer there. The welcome sign that had identified the town as Millbrook, with a population of 847, was also missing, replaced by a generic highway marker showing only the route number. We drove back to where the gas station had been, but now found only an empty lot with no buildings, pumps, or other infrastructure. The cafe where we'd eaten ice cream and pie was gone, replaced by an abandoned building with boarded-up windows and a for sale sign that looked like it had been there for years. The community center, the hardware store, the grocery market, all of the businesses we'd visited or observed were either missing entirely or reduced to empty, deteriorating structures. Even more disturbing, when I checked my wallet, I found that the money I'd spent on gas, snacks, and food was back in my possession. The receipts I'd been given were no longer in my pockets, and the postcards and souvenirs the kids had purchased were missing from our car. It was as if our entire interaction with Millbrook and its residents had been erased, leaving no evidence that the town or its people had ever existed. We drove out of the area as quickly as possible and didn't stop until we reached a large truck stop about 50 miles down the highway. When I asked the attendant about Millbrook, he looked at me with confusion and said there was no town by that name anywhere in the area. According to him, the region where we'd stopped was sparsely populated farmland, with no significant communities for miles in any direction. Later research confirmed that there was no record of a town called Millbrook in that part of Kansas, no businesses at the location where we'd stopped, and no historical evidence that such a community had ever existed. The land was privately owned agricultural property that had been in the same family for over a century. And the owners confirmed that no commercial development had ever been permitted on their property. We never found a rational explanation for what we experienced that day. The town, its residents, and our interactions with them seemed completely real while they were happening, but left no trace of their existence once we departed. Salem's photos from that day show only empty fields and abandoned buildings, with no evidence of the thriving community we'd visited. Dario's postcard and flag are missing, and even Maria's carefully maintained travel journal contains no entries for our stop in Millbrook. The experience changed our family's perspective on reality and the nature of the places we encountered during our travels. We completed our move to Atlanta, but we've never taken another extended road trip together. The possibility that we might encounter another Millbrook, another place that exists temporarily and then vanishes without explanation, is too disturbing to risk with my children. Sometimes, I wonder if Millbrook still exists for other travelers, appearing to families who need to stop for gas or food, providing them with friendly service and warm hospitality before disappearing once they continue their journey. Maybe we're not the only people who've experienced this phenomenon, and maybe there are other towns scattered across America that exist only for brief encounters with passing strangers, offering glimpses of communities that never were or that exist somehow outside our normal understanding of time and space. The most sinister thing about a perfectly timed breakdown isn't the mechanical failure itself. It's discovering that someone has been sabotaging vehicles at the exact location where multiple travelers have disappeared over the past year. I learned this in the Arizona desert, where my road trip with my best friend turned into a deadly game of survival against predators who had turned a remote stretch of highway into their personal hunting ground. My name is Chaya, and this happened last spring when my best friend Amaya and I decided to take a girls' road trip from Los Angeles to Austin for South by Southwest. We'd been planning this trip for months, saving money and coordinating our schedules so we could take a full week off work. Amaya had just gotten out of a terrible relationship, and I was dealing with job stress, so we both needed this escape. The plan was to drive through Arizona and New Mexico, stopping at interesting places along the way and arriving in Austin with enough time to enjoy the music festival. We left LA early on a Saturday morning in my 2019 Subaru Outback, which I'd had serviced the week before specifically for this trip. The mechanic had checked everything: brakes, transmission, cooling system, tires, and assured me the car was in perfect condition for a long-distance drive. We'd packed camping gear, plenty of water and snacks, and emergency supplies, including a satellite communicator that would work even in areas without cell service. The first day went perfectly. We drove through the Mojave Desert, stopped in Flagstaff for lunch and shopping, and made it to our hotel in Phoenix by evening. The car ran beautifully, the weather was ideal, and we were both excited about the adventure ahead. We spent the evening exploring downtown Phoenix, trying local restaurants, and planning our route for the next day through the Sonoran Desert toward Tucson. On Sunday morning, we left Phoenix around 9 a.m., taking Interstate 10 east toward Tucson, and then planning to cut south on smaller highways toward the Mexican border. The scenery was incredible. Classic desert landscape with saguaro cacti, rocky mountains, and endless blue skies. We were making good time and enjoying the conversation when, about 60 miles east of Phoenix, near a place called Dragoon, my car started making unusual noises. At first, it was just a slight knocking sound from the engine that seemed to come and go depending on our speed. Amaya suggested we pull over and check the oil, but the sound wasn't consistent enough to seem like an immediate emergency. We were in a very remote area with no services visible in any direction, so I decided to continue toward the next town rather than stop in the middle of nowhere. But about 10 minutes later, the knocking became more pronounced and the car started losing power. The engine temperature gauge was climbing toward the red zone, and I could smell something burning. We were approaching a scenic overlook area that provided a safe place to pull off the highway, so I managed to get the car off the road before it completely died. The overlook was at the top of a small rise that provided a view of the desert stretching for miles in every direction. It was a beautiful location, but also completely isolated. We could see the highway stretching toward the horizon in both directions, but there were no other vehicles visible and no buildings or settlements anywhere in the landscape. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away, and our cell phones showed no signal. When I popped the hood, it was immediately obvious that something was seriously wrong. There was steam rising from the engine, and I could see that several hoses had burst, spraying coolant everywhere. What was strange was that the damage looked fresh and extensive, like multiple components had failed simultaneously. For a car that had just been serviced and was running perfectly an hour earlier, this seemed like an impossible coincidence. Amaya tried to use our satellite communicator to call for help, but the device wasn't connecting to satellites properly. The display showed that it was searching for a signal, but it couldn't establish communication with the emergency services. This was particularly frustrating, because I'd specifically chosen this device for situations exactly like this, and the salesman had assured me it would work anywhere in North America. While we were trying to figure out our communication options, we heard an engine approaching from the west. A pickup truck appeared over the hill and slowed down when the driver saw our disabled car. Two men got out. Both appeared to be in their 40s, wearing work clothes and baseball caps. They seemed genuinely concerned about our situation and immediately offered to help. The driver introduced himself as Rick and said he and his friend Dave lived in the area and were familiar with car troubles on this stretch of highway. Rick looked under our hood and quickly diagnosed the problem as multiple coolant system failures that would require professional repair. He said the nearest town with a mechanic was about 30 miles away. But he could give us a ride there while Dave stayed with our car to make sure it wasn't vandalized or stripped for parts. Something about this arrangement made me uncomfortable, but we seemed to have limited options. We were stranded in an extremely remote location with no working communication devices and a car that was obviously not going anywhere without major repairs. The men seemed helpful and knowledgeable about local conditions, and their offer to split up so one could stay with our car suggested they weren't planning anything malicious. But as Rick was describing the route to town and the services available there, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind our car, partially hidden by a large rock formation, I could see what appeared to be another disabled vehicle. It was a sedan that looked like it had been there for a while, with dust accumulated on the surfaces and one of the doors standing slightly open. When I mentioned this to Rick, his demeanor changed immediately. Instead of the helpful local resident, he suddenly seemed guarded and nervous. He claimed he didn't know anything about the other car and suggested that people abandoned vehicles in the desert all the time when repairs became too expensive. But his explanation was unconvincing, and I could see Dave moving around behind our car in a way that seemed more like he was positioning himself than examining the vehicle. I told Amaya we needed to get some items from our car before leaving with Rick. But instead of gathering belongings, I whispered to her that something was wrong and we needed to be prepared to run. She looked confused, but followed my lead as I grabbed our backpack with water and emergency supplies. That's when I noticed that Dave had moved to a position where he could block our access to the highway if we tried to leave on foot. Rick was becoming increasingly insistent that we get in his truck, saying that afternoon temperatures in the desert were dangerous and we needed to get to town quickly. But his urgency seemed forced. And I realized that both men were subtly moving to positions where they could control our movements. The helpful strangers were revealing themselves to be something much more threatening. Instead of getting in their truck, I told Rick we wanted to stay with our car and wait for other travelers to come by. This clearly wasn't the response he was expecting, and he started arguing that we could be stranded for hours or even days in such a remote location. When I remained firm about not leaving our vehicle, he exchanged a look with Dave that confirmed my suspicions about their intentions. That's when Dave made his move, rushing toward us from behind our car while Rick moved to block our escape route toward the highway. But I'd been expecting something like this, and Amaya and I ran in different directions, forcing them to choose which one to pursue. I ran toward the rock formation where I'd seen the abandoned car, hoping to find some kind of shelter or weapon, while Amaya ran toward the highway, hoping to flag down passing traffic. What I found behind the rocks was much worse than an abandoned vehicle. There were actually 3 cars in various states of decay, along with personal belongings scattered around the area and evidence that people had been held here against their will. There were restraints attached to one of the vehicles, camping equipment that suggested people had been kept in this location for extended periods, and worst of all, a notebook documenting the details of what appeared to be multiple kidnappings over the past year. The notebook contained information about travelers who had been stranded at this exact location under circumstances similar to ours. Couples, families, solo travelers, all experiencing sudden mechanical failures that required them to stop at the scenic overlook. The entries described how Rick and Dave would approach victims offering help, then isolate them in this remote location for purposes I didn't want to think about. From my hiding spot behind the rocks, I could see that Dave had caught up with Amaya and was forcing her back toward the overlook area. Rick was searching for me, calling out that they just wanted to help and that running away in the desert was dangerous. But I'd seen enough evidence to know that getting captured by these men would likely be fatal. I used the scattered belongings around the abandoned cars to create a distraction, throwing rocks and debris to make noise in different locations while I worked my way back toward the highway. My plan was to reach the road and try to stop passing traffic for help. But when I got to the overlook, I saw that Rick's truck was positioned to block the highway access, and Dave was guarding Amaya near our disabled car. That's when I realized that our car breakdown hadn't been a coincidence or mechanical failure. These men had somehow sabotaged our vehicle, probably by damaging the cooling system while we were stopped somewhere earlier in our trip. The simultaneous failure of multiple components, the perfect timing of the breakdown at this isolated location, and the quick appearance of helpful strangers all pointed to a carefully planned trap. I managed to activate our satellite communicator by climbing onto the roof of one of the abandoned cars, which gave me enough elevation to establish a connection. The emergency operator who answered was initially skeptical of my story. But when I described the location and the evidence I'd found, she immediately dispatched law enforcement and search and rescue teams to our coordinates. The response was faster than I'd expected because, as I learned later, this area had been the subject of an ongoing investigation into missing travelers. Multiple people had disappeared along this stretch of highway over the past 18 months, and law enforcement had suspected that the disappearances were connected, but hadn't been able to identify the specific location or methods being used. Rick and Dave were arrested when the authorities arrived, and the investigation revealed that they'd been operating this trap for over 2 years. They would identify suitable targets at gas stations and rest areas, follow them to determine their routes, then sabotage their vehicles using mechanical knowledge that Rick had gained from years working as an auto mechanic. The scenic overlook provided the perfect location to isolate victims while maintaining the appearance of being helpful local residents. The evidence recovered from the site led to the resolution of 11 missing persons cases and revealed that Rick and Dave were part of a larger network that operated similar traps at remote locations across several southwestern states. They were targeting travelers who were unlikely to be missed immediately, people on solo trips, couples without detailed itineraries, and anyone who seemed to be traveling without regular contact with family or friends. Amaya and I were incredibly fortunate to escape, but the experience changed both of us permanently. We never completed our trip to Austin, and neither of us has taken another extended road trip since then. The knowledge that predators are actively hunting travelers on our highways, using sophisticated methods to create situations where people become vulnerable, has made us much more cautious about travel, and much more aware of how easily things can go wrong when you're far from help. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how perfectly the trap had been designed. The mechanical sabotage, the isolated location, the helpful strangers, even the failure of our communication devices. Everything had been calculated to create a situation where victims would have no choice but to trust people who intended to harm them. If I hadn't noticed that abandoned car and recognized the signs of danger, Amaya and I would have become 2 more entries in Rick's notebook, and our families would never have known what happened to us on that remote stretch of Arizona highway. The most terrifying moment isn't when your GPS stops working. It's when it starts giving you directions in a voice you've never heard before, speaking your name and guiding you toward places you never programmed it to find. I discovered this on the remote highways of Oregon, where my navigation system became possessed by someone who knew exactly where I was going and exactly what was waiting for me there. My name is Layla, and I work as a pharmaceutical sales representative covering the Pacific Northwest. This happened 8 months ago when I was driving from Portland to a series of medical conferences in smaller Oregon towns. I'd made this general route many times over the past 3 years, but this particular trip involved visiting some rural hospitals and clinics I'd never been to before. So I was depending heavily on my GPS navigation system to guide me through unfamiliar territory. I left Portland early on a Tuesday morning, planning to visit facilities in Bend, Burns, and several smaller communities over the next 2 days. My first stop was supposed to be a hospital in Bend, about a 3-hour drive southeast through the Cascade Mountains. I'd programmed my GPS with all my destinations the night before, organizing them in the most efficient route to minimize driving time and maximize my client visits. The drive started normally, taking Highway 26 east through the mountains toward Bend. The scenery was beautiful. Dense forests, mountain peaks, and clear mountain streams running alongside the highway. Traffic was light, mostly locals and a few recreational vehicles heading toward outdoor recreation areas. My GPS was providing standard directions in the familiar computerized voice I'd been hearing for the past 2 years. About an hour into the drive, somewhere near Government Camp, my GPS suddenly announced a route recalculation in a voice I'd never heard before. Instead of the standard female computer voice, this was a man's voice with a slight accent that I couldn't immediately identify. He said, "Layla, I've found a better route to your destination. Please follow my directions for optimal travel time." The use of my name was startling, because I'd never programmed personal information into the navigation system. I assumed this was some kind of software update that had activated overnight, adding personalization features and perhaps voice options I hadn't explored before. Technology companies were constantly updating their systems, and it wasn't unusual for new features to appear without specific user activation. The voice was pleasant and professional, and the directions seemed to be taking me in the right general direction, toward Bend. But after about 20 minutes, the new voice directed me to take an exit onto a smaller highway that I didn't recognize from my previous trips through this area. When I questioned the route, the voice responded by saying, "Trust me, Layla. This route will save you significant time and avoid traffic delays ahead." The fact that it was responding to my spoken concerns was impressive technology, but something about the interaction felt more personal than I'd expect from a navigation system. The smaller highway led through increasingly remote terrain, winding through dense forest with very few other vehicles. The road was well maintained but narrow, and I began to feel isolated from the main travel corridors I was familiar with. When I tried to manually redirect the GPS back to Highway 26, the system wouldn't accept the changes, displaying an error message that said my original route was no longer available due to road closures. About 30 minutes into this detour, the voice provided information that made me extremely uncomfortable. It said, "Layla, I know you're concerned about this route, but I also know you have meetings scheduled with Dr. Martinez at 2 p.m. and Dr. Thompson at 4 p.m. This route will ensure you arrive on time for both appointments. I had never entered these names or appointment times into any device, and the specific information was known only to me and my scheduling system at work. I pulled over at a small rest area to investigate my GPS settings and try to understand how it had access to my personal schedule information. While I was parked, the voice continued speaking, providing details about my life that became increasingly specific and disturbing. It knew about my apartment address in Portland, my work history, and even personal details about my family members in other states. When I tried to turn off the GPS entirely, the screen wouldn't respond to my inputs. The voice continued giving directions, now telling me to continue north on this remote highway toward a destination it called the meeting point. When I asked what meeting point it was referring to, the voice said, "The place where people like you go when they've been selected for special opportunities. You'll understand when you arrive." I decided to ignore the GPS entirely and turn around to find my way back to Highway 26. But when I tried to reverse direction, I found that the road behind me was blocked by what appeared to be a maintenance crew working on bridge repairs. The workers told me the road would be closed for several hours and that I needed to continue forward to the next intersection where I could turn around safely. This seemed like an impossible coincidence, and I was beginning to suspect that my route was being controlled by someone who had hacked into my navigation system. The maintenance crew's timing, the GPS's knowledge of my personal information, and the increasingly isolated route all suggested a coordinated effort to guide me toward a specific location for reasons I couldn't understand. As I continued north on the remote highway, the voice became more conversational and personal, discussing my career goals, my relationships, and my concerns about traveling alone in unfamiliar areas. It was like talking to someone who had been observing my life in detail, not interacting with a navigation system. The voice expressed concern for my safety and assured me that the people waiting at the meeting point had my best interests in mind. About an hour later, the GPS directed me to turn onto an even smaller road that led deeper into the Oregon forest. This was clearly not a route toward any legitimate business destination, and I was now certain that someone was using technology to lure me to a remote location. When I refused to make the turn and tried to continue on the main highway, my car's engine suddenly started losing power and making mechanical noises that forced me to pull over. While I was stopped on the side of the road trying to understand what was happening to my vehicle, the GPS voice said, "Layla, your car will be fine once you follow the correct route. The people waiting for you have the ability to resolve both your navigation and mechanical problems. Please trust the process and continue to the meeting point." This confirmed that whoever was controlling my GPS also had the ability to remotely affect my vehicle's operation. I realized I was dealing with a sophisticated kidnapping operation that used technology to control victims' movements and isolate them in remote locations. The personal information, the route manipulation, the mechanical sabotage, and the coordinated road closures all pointed to a well-funded organization with advanced technical capabilities and multiple people working together, instead of following the GPS directions to the meeting point. I abandoned my car and started walking back toward the main highway, hoping to find help or at least reach an area with cell phone coverage. But as I walked, I could hear vehicles approaching from different directions, and I realized that people were coming to intercept me before I could escape the area. I hid in the forest beside the road and watched as several vehicles arrived at my abandoned car. The people who got out were dressed in casual outdoor clothing, but they moved with the coordination and purpose of people conducting a professional operation. They searched my car, examined the surrounding area, and used radio communications to coordinate with others who seemed to be positioned at different locations along the highway. From my hiding spot, I could hear fragments of their radio conversations discussing search patterns and contingency plans for finding me before I reached populated areas or communication coverage. It was clear that this wasn't a random crime, but a carefully planned operation involving multiple people and sophisticated resources. I managed to evade the search teams by moving through the forest parallel to the highway, avoiding the roads entirely. After several hours of hiking through difficult terrain, I reached a main highway where I was able to flag down a state police patrol car. The trooper initially thought I was reporting a vehicle breakdown. But when I described the GPS manipulation and the coordinated response to my escape attempt, he immediately called for backup and specialist investigators. The investigation revealed that I had been targeted by a human trafficking network that specialized in using technology to isolate and capture victims. They would hack into navigation systems, access personal information through various digital sources, and use remote vehicle control capabilities to force people off main travel routes toward predetermined capture locations. The operation involved multiple people stationed along various highways throughout Oregon and Washington, with technical specialists who could manipulate GPS systems and vehicle electronics remotely. They targeted individuals traveling alone through remote areas, particularly people whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed due to flexible work schedules or independent travel patterns. Law enforcement officials told me that my case was part of a broader investigation into disappearances across the Pacific Northwest, and that my escape and testimony provided crucial information about the methods being used. Several arrests were made in connection with the network, but many of the people involved were never identified. And the investigation suggested the operation was much larger than initially suspected. I never retrieved my car from that remote forest road, and I changed jobs to avoid traveling alone through rural areas. The experience taught me that our increasing dependence on technology makes us vulnerable to predators who understand these systems better than we do, and that the devices we trust to keep us safe can be turned into weapons against us by people with sufficient technical knowledge and malicious intent. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how completely my movements and choices had been controlled without my knowledge. The GPS voice that had seemed like helpful technology was actually a person who knew intimate details about my life and was guiding me toward people who intended to make me disappear forever. The fact that they could access my personal information, control my vehicle, and coordinate multiple people across a large geographic area suggested that this type of technological kidnapping might be much more common than anyone realizes. The most horrifying realization isn't that you've lost hours of your life to memory gaps. It's discovering video footage of yourself doing things you can't remember during time that shouldn't exist. I learned this during what should have been routine long-distance drives across the country, when I found evidence that someone had been systematically drugging me and documenting my unconscious activities for months. My name is Holland, and I'm a long-haul truck driver who's been working cross-country routes for 8 years. This started happening about 10 months ago during what seemed like normal runs between distribution centers across the Midwest and South. I specialize in electronics transport, carrying high-value cargo between major cities, which requires me to maintain strict schedules and follow specific routes approved by my company and insurance providers. The first time I noticed something was wrong was during a run from Memphis to Dallas last winter. I'd left Memphis around 6 in the evening, planning to drive straight through the night and arrive in Dallas by morning. It was a route I'd driven dozens of times, and I knew exactly how long it should take and where I'd need to stop for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. But when I arrived at the delivery location, my logbook showed I'd made the trip in significantly less time than should have been possible. According to my records, I'd driven the 470 miles in about 5 hours, which would have required me to average nearly 95 miles per hour for the entire trip. This was impossible given speed limits, traffic conditions, and the mandatory rest stops required by federal trucking regulations. But my delivery was on time, my cargo was secure, and I felt reasonably alert despite having no memory of most of the drive. I assumed I'd made an error in my logbook or had somehow lost track of time during the night drive. Long-haul trucking can be mentally exhausting, and it wasn't unusual for experienced drivers to have periods where they drove on autopilot without clear memories of specific stretches of highway. I made a note to be more careful about documenting my trips, but I didn't think the incident was particularly significant. The second occurrence was more disturbing. I was driving from Atlanta to Kansas City, another overnight run that should have taken about 10 hours, including mandatory rest stops. I remembered leaving Atlanta around 8 p.m., but my next clear memory was arriving at the delivery location in Kansas City around 5 a.m. According to my logbook and GPS records, I'd completed a 550-mile journey in less than 9 hours, which again suggested speeds that were impossible given normal driving conditions. More concerning was that I felt unusually tired and disoriented when I arrived in Kansas City. I had a persistent headache, my mouth was dry, and I felt like I was recovering from some kind of illness. I'd experienced similar symptoms occasionally after long drives, but this was more intense than usual. I attributed it to dehydration and fatigue. But I was beginning to worry about my health and my ability to safely operate a commercial vehicle. The third incident convinced me that something was seriously wrong. I was transporting electronics from Phoenix to Denver, a route that normally takes about 12 hours, including stops. I left Phoenix in the early afternoon, planning to drive through the night and arrive in Denver the following morning. But when I reached the delivery location, I discovered I'd lost nearly 6 hours somewhere during the trip. My logbook showed that I'd stopped for fuel and a mandatory rest break at a truck stop near Flagstaff, Arizona, around 8 p.m. But my next entry wasn't until 2 a.m. at another truck stop near Albuquerque, New Mexico. I had no memory of the drive between these locations, which covered about 220 miles of highway through some of the most scenic and memorable terrain in the Southwest. It was impossible that I could have driven this route without forming any memories of the journey. When I tried to reconstruct what had happened during those missing hours, I discovered that my fuel consumption didn't match the distance I'd supposedly traveled. My truck should have used significantly more diesel fuel to cover the miles recorded in my logbook. But the tank was fuller than it should have been. It was as if someone had refueled my vehicle during the period I couldn't remember. But I had no receipt or record of making any fuel purchases. I started keeping more detailed records of my trips, documenting not just times and locations, but also fuel levels, odometer readings, and even photographs of my cargo at various points during each journey. I also began setting alarms on my phone to wake me up every 2 hours during long drives, hoping to maintain better awareness of my activities and prevent extended periods without clear memories. But the memory gaps continued to occur, always during overnight drives through remote areas where truck stops were few and far between. I would remember the beginning of a journey clearly, then suddenly find myself at my destination with hours of missing time and evidence that my truck had been driven, refueled, and sometimes even serviced during periods I couldn't account for. The breakthrough came when I discovered that my truck's onboard GPS system had been recording more detailed location data than I'd realized. Most commercial vehicles have tracking systems that log position, speed, and other data for insurance and regulatory purposes. But I hadn't been regularly reviewing this information. When I finally accessed the complete records, I found evidence of activities during my missing time periods that were impossible to explain. During one of my memory gaps, the GPS showed that my truck had been parked at a location that wasn't a truck stop or rest area. It was a private facility in rural New Mexico that didn't appear on any commercial trucking directories. The vehicle had remained stationary there for over 3 hours before continuing toward my designated destination. When I researched the location using satellite imagery, I found a compound with several buildings and what appeared to be specialized equipment for vehicle maintenance. I decided to investigate this location during my next trip through the area, planning to stop there deliberately instead of experiencing another unexplained gap in my memory. But when I reached the coordinates where my truck had supposedly been parked, I found only empty desert with no buildings, roads, or other infrastructure. It was as if the facility I'd seen in satellite images had never existed. That's when I realized that my GPS records might have been falsified, and that someone was creating fictional documentation of my activities during periods when I was unconscious or incapacitated. The missing time, the impossible fuel consumption, and the falsified location data all pointed to a sophisticated operation designed to use my vehicle and my identity for purposes I couldn't understand. I installed a hidden camera in my truck's cab, hoping to record what happened during my next memory gap. The camera was positioned to capture both the interior of the cab and the view through the windshield, giving me a complete record of activities that occurred while I was supposedly driving. I also began carrying a personal GPS device that would create independent location records separate from my truck's official tracking system. The footage I captured during my next overnight run was more disturbing than I'd imagined possible. The video showed me driving normally for the first few hours of the journey, but then there was a period where I appeared to become drowsy and disoriented. I could see myself pulling over at a truck stop, but instead of resting or refueling, I was approached by people who seemed to be expecting me. These individuals helped me out of my truck and guided me into a building at the truck stop, supporting me like I was ill or intoxicated. The video showed that I was conscious but clearly impaired, unable to walk steadily or speak clearly. After about an hour, different people brought me back to my truck. But now, someone else was in the driver's seat while I was placed in the sleeping berth behind the cab. The most shocking part of the footage was watching a stranger drive my truck for several hours while I was unconscious in the back. This person clearly knew how to operate the vehicle and seemed familiar with the route, making stops and following procedures that suggested they'd done this before. During one stop, they transferred cargo from my truck to another vehicle, then loaded different items back into my trailer before continuing the journey. Near the end of the recorded period, the unknown driver returned my truck to another location where the original group of people were waiting. They woke me up gradually, gave me coffee that was probably drugged to help me regain alertness, and put me back in the driver's seat with instructions to continue to my designated destination. The transition was handled so smoothly that I had no awareness of what had occurred during the previous 6 hours. When I reviewed the footage, I realized that I'd been systematically drugged and used as an unwitting courier for some kind of smuggling operation. The people involved knew my routes, my schedule, and my personal habits well enough to predict when and where to intercept me. They had access to truck stops along my regular routes and sophisticated methods for temporarily incapacitating drivers without leaving obvious evidence of their activities. I immediately reported the situation to law enforcement and my trucking company, providing them with the video evidence and GPS records that documented the criminal operation. The investigation revealed that I wasn't the only driver who'd been targeted. Dozens of long-haul truckers had reported similar experiences of missing time and unexplained activities during overnight runs through remote areas. The smuggling network was using commercial truck drivers as unwitting transporters for drugs, weapons, and other illegal cargo. They would drug drivers at specific truck stops, use the vehicles to transport contraband, then return the trucks to their original routes with the drivers unaware of what had occurred. The operation was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies that focused on traditional smuggling methods. Several arrests were made in connection with the network, but the investigation revealed that the operation was much larger than initially suspected, with participants at truck stops across multiple states and sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting suitable drivers. The people involved had inside information about trucking schedules, routes, and company procedures that suggested corruption within the transportation industry itself. I stopped long-haul trucking immediately after this discovery and found local driving work that doesn't require overnight trips or travel through remote areas. The experience taught me that criminals are constantly looking for ways to exploit honest workers, and that our transportation infrastructure is more vulnerable to systematic abuse than most people realize. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was realizing how completely my life and work had been controlled without my knowledge for months. I'd been living with gaps in my memory and unexplained fatigue, while unknowingly participating in criminal activities that could have resulted in serious legal consequences for me. The fact that this was happening to multiple drivers suggests that there are probably other transportation workers who are currently being exploited in similar ways without realizing it. If you found these stories as unsettling as they should be, remember that the highways we travel every day hide dangers that most of us never imagine. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more true stories that reveal the hidden darkness in our everyday world. And never forget that the most terrifying experiences are often the ones that seem completely normal until it's too late to escape.